Okay, first of all, greetings to everyone. And let's just start with a couple of thank yous. First of all, thanks to Ariel, who's making this work technically. Can people just give me a wave so I can know that people are hearing me? Thanks very much. Okay, so first of all, first thing I'd like to is dedicate this class to Henna Riva Bas Beryl, that's Suzanne's mother, whose yahrzeit is actually tonight. And I thought we could speak a little bit about honoring parents as well, in terms of the 10 Commandments, which is obviously a central Shavuot topic, but let's dedicate that to her. And a couple of other thank yous before we begin. One is to my son Benny for a lot of work that he's done on putting the site and the whole operation together. Bina for fantastic administration, my daughter. My son Gavi for amazing graphics. He did the poster and the flyer. 3 trustees who helped me in everything that I do, including the website. That's Paul, Michael, and Brad. Also like to acknowledge the JLE London, which is basically my day job. A fantastic outreach center that we run here in London. Also like to thank the members of the newsletter for 2 things. First of all, supporting me. That means being part of it so that I get to teach and put out Torah material. And as always, I want to thank people for donations. I'd like to make it clear again that no one's ever been solicited for any donation. These are completely spontaneous that people send in. Tremendously appreciated. And although the idea here is to make teaching available specifically for free, obviously it takes funding to keep the website running and publications, recordings, and so on. So very, very much appreciated. And I especially appreciate the fact that these donations are spontaneous. 2 things I'd like to say. One is my daughter Ruthie just came out with a new book, so I want to very proudly demonstrate it. That's a book called Hyperemesis. It's a book on extreme pregnancy sickness. I'm not going to spend time now going into the diagnosis and what it means, but for women who have hyperemesis, which means they extreme nausea and vomiting of pregnancy, they can't keep things down, often hospitalized, dehydrated. She's written an amazing book here. She has endorsements from 2 professors from London hospitals. I wrote a chapter in it as well on the medical aspects. And it's a spiritual approach to extreme pregnancy sickness, but it's also a general approach to life ordeals and difficulties. So please make note of that. Hyperemesis, a spiritual perspective. Ruthie Halberstadt. And of course, we expect all our members to promote it at every opportunity. And while we're on the subject, my own book just came out between the last time we met, and that is called Shabbat and the Festivals. So as I always say, you need at least 2 copies if you want to understand it well. And if you kind enough to promote it, if you like it, and tell people about it, I'd certainly appreciate that. So that's the thank yous. And let's move on and talk about the festival of Shavuot and see if we can get a deeper understanding of one aspect of Torah. And let me begin just with a request for those of you who care to show your faces. The reason is that it's difficult to speak to black boxes. And if I see people who look more or less human or halfway awake, that is much easier to speak to people who are obviously not falling asleep or, so that's just much easier. I appreciate it if you feel your face is just not viewable. So I wouldn't insist, but of course it is much easier to speak to people who are look human. Let us talk about one theme that is central to the day or the festival of Shavuot, and that is obviously the theme of the 10 Commandments. Let's set the agenda as follows. I'd like to speak about the 10 Commandments in theory, and then try to bring it down to the practical, at least dealing with one. I'd like to speak about actually 2, namely honoring parents and not coveting, and try to show the connection between them. I doubt we'll have time to go into both of those fully. So today what we'll do is we'll emphasize the theme of honoring parents. But before I do that, I'd like to explain something about the 10 Commandments themselves, raise a few questions about them, and I hope that you'll find it meaningful when we begin to speak about that particular commandment. So again, this is our, I just remember to switch on the recorder. So this is our webinar, Pre-Shavuot 2023. That is 5783. We said some thank yous. We dedicated the shiur to Hannah Riobas Beryl. And the theme we'd like to speak about is the Ten Commandments with particular application or focus on one of them. So let's begin with a few questions about the Ten Commandments, being that this is a few days before receiving the Torah, obviously the cosmic event, the unique node in history, which was the receiving of the Torah some 3,300 odd years ago, 3,330 something years ago. And that defined us, that began our journey through history. All else derives from there. And we need to understand what that event was, how unique it was. And central to that event was the giving of the Ten Commandments. By the way, before we even approach the Ten Commandments, I'd just like to reiterate the fact that this is a unique point in all of human history. I'm not sure how many people are aware that it's the only time in the history of the humankind that anyone has ever claimed that God spoke to them with even one witness. Let's say that again. Many people have claimed miraculous things. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a claim that God spoke to you directly. That has only been claimed once in all of history. And there are plenty of liars out there. We know lots of people are lying. We know that because many religious claims are mutually exclusive. And despite the fact that somebody's lying, no one, including all the liars, has ever had the chutzpah to claim that they had a direct conversation with God with even one witness except the Jews, which is either a massive chutzpah, an unbelievable chutzpah, or true. We are the only ones in all of history who's ever claimed that God spoke to us with even one witness, and we claim a few million witnesses. The figures we put are about 3.2 million Jews, about 3.2 million converted Egyptians. But at any rate, you're talking about millions. Christianity begins with Paul's famous vision on the Damascus Road. No one was present with him during that revelation, and the Jews rejected him. Muhammad came out of his tent and said that Allah spoke to him. And the Jews asked who witnessed it with him, and he said no one, and we said that's not good enough for us. And if you trace historical revelations through history, all the way down to Joseph Smith, who began the Mormon religion right in the 1800s, he said that he had a vision. Who was with you? It was personal. And tens and hundreds of thousands of people follow that religion. And in our book, that is not any sort of corroboration. We demand witnessing, and we are the only time, again, in history who claims that there were witnesses to the revelation, and in our case, we claim the whole nation. This is a wonderful theme. You can look it up in the Kuzari, which is the classic work of establishing corroboration and the veracity of that transmission, not only the claim for what the event was, but also the claim for how can we rely on the reliability of the transmission. After all, it may be a unique claim, but who says that the nature of that claim has been transmitted accurately through history? That's a subject that also needs to be discussed, and I'm not going to go into that now. But let's turn our attention to the main event of that revelation, which was the people hearing Hashem, hearing God speak to them openly, and then giving us the Ten Commandments. The opinion of the Rambam, again, there are subtly different opinions here, but the general opinion is that we heard God speak only the Ten Commandments, not the rest of the Torah. The Rambam says we heard God speak the Ten Commandments, whether we heard all 10, or we heard all 10 together, or we heard the first 2 from which the rest are derived, or we heard the first 2 together, the different opinions. But essentially we heard and experienced directly firsthand in a prophetic fashion that revelation. And we also heard God say to Moses, you tell them the rest of the Torah, which means that we have a direct ratification of the Torah from having heard it ourselves, not the whole Torah, hearing a divine revelation, and also hearing God ratify and validate Moshe as the one who would give us the rest of the Torah. And a moment's thought will show you that that's logically necessary. If anyone handed us the Torah without corroboration like that, we'd say, well, maybe you're a charismatic teacher, maybe you made it up, maybe someone will come along and give us a prophecy that supersedes yours. Those are all open questions. And therefore, there was necessary a one-time revelation in history that was beyond cavil, and that was our personal experience, transmitted by a whole generation to their children, telling them that that's what we experienced. And the nature of the experience was our own direct, unmediated, unedited contact with the God himself, and hearing him say that the rest of the Torah, which you will not hear from me, you'll hear from Moses, is in fact authentic. That's what happened. At the same time as we heard the Ten Commandments, we were given the Ten Commandments. Let's stop here for just a moment to note that all human interaction, and that being derived from all godly interaction, always involves 2 modes. The 2 modes are speaking and acting. Think about it. How do you express yourself? You have only two modes of expression in the world. You either speak or you act. Acting is a form of speaking. Gestures and movement is also a form of speech. But those are the two modes. And notice that when God relates to us, he always uses both. For example, when he created the world, Vayomer Elokim, God said, and his words created the world. Vayas Elokim, and God did. So you see that he establishes communication with his world and later with us in two modes. He speaks and he acts. That runs all the way through from the creation itself through all of Revelation. The later version of this, of course, we call prophecy. How does God speak to us in the latter generations of history? Prophecy. And what do prophets do? Two modes. Prophets speak God's word and produce God's actions, namely miracles. No miracle ever occurred in the Torah ever without the presence of a prophet. Why is that necessary? Because the prophet is representing God, manifesting and expressing God in the world, and the prophet does it in the same two modes. Therefore, the prophets both speak and produce miracles. Speech, which is a prophecy, a transcendent speech, and a miraculous type of speech, and miracles, which are miraculous actions in the world. And therefore, it should be plain to you that when we met God at Sinai, he related to us in both those ways. We heard him speak, we heard the Ten Commandments, and he gave them to us. You ask the question, why did he give us the Ten Commandments on the two tablets of stone? We heard him. Was he worried we might forget? Forget that sort of thing. So why was it necessary for him to speak and to give? And their answer is, those are the two modes of operation in the world. And so we heard the Ten Commandments and we received them. So he spoke them and he wrote them or carved them. And therefore we came away from that experience having heard and experienced and taking with us Ten Commandments engraved or bored into a diamond-like stone, which the Jewish people received at that time. Now, let's ask a few questions about the Ten Commandments themselves. So the first question, maybe, in no particular order, but that's one of the first questions, is why the Ten Commandments needed to be engraved on stone as opposed to written on parchment. The Torah, including Ten Commandments, is written on parchment, ink on paper, diaf on clay, didioy on cloth, which is a halachic correct ink on the parchment. That is writing. Why was the Torah also necessary to give us in stone? Not only in stone, but in etched or engraved in stone, and not only engraved in stone, but bored through. We have a tradition that the tablets of the Ten Commandments were on stone. They were 6 tvachim by 6 tvachim. That's 6 hands breadths, right, in extent. Incidentally, weighing an unbelievable amount. Talking about solid diamond or whatever the stone was. We usually translate it as even sapiri. Some translate it as sapphire, but probably it means diamond. And the commandments were bored through, not simply etched on the surface, but bored right through, which means if you looked at the letters, you could see right through the tablets. And here we have a miracle as well, because our tradition is that the tablets were bored through, but legible forwards on both sides. In other words, you're looking at the front and you read the words, but if you read it from the back, you don't see the words backwards. You see them forwards too, which means that they were frontwards whichever way you look. In fact, there is a tradition that not only the Ten Commandments were engraved on the tablets, but the whole Torah itself, including the oral law. Which means, if you think about it for a moment, there was no oral law. Oral law means that which is not written. And if they were all written on the tablets, there was no oral law. But what I mean is, what would later be known as the Mishnah or the oral law was at that time written on the tablets. But however you look at it, fundamentally, the main thing that was engraved on those tablets was the Ten Commandments. And as I said, not only engraved, but bored all the way through. And the question is why? Why was the rest of the Torah available to us on parchment in writing? When it comes to the Ten Commandments, they were given as an etched or bored three-dimensional reality. The second question is, why were we given 10? The Torah is a composite entity, and the Rambam writes in his fundamental principles of Torah that if you deny one word of Torah, irrelevant which one, you've denied the whole Torah. There's no more important or less important parts of Torah from this perspective. If you, and he brings down the law, that if a person denies a verse in the Torah which seemingly is completely dispensable, for example, v'achais loitan timna, that the sister of Lotan was called Timna. Does the Torah really fall if you delete that? Do we really need to know who her brother was and what the sister's name was? If you delete that line, you've invalidated the whole Torah. Like an electric circuit, we're taking out any part, doesn't matter which part you take, the lights go out. And therefore, the Torah is all absolutely indispensable. And if that's true, why were we given 10 selected commandments? Right? If the whole Torah is all necessary and all organically bonded into one, why was it necessary to give us 10? And of course, why those 10? Now, when Moshe Rabbeinu came down the mountain with the 10 commandments, the basic question again is, why did he bring us only 10? So some people think, well, they were heavy, they were heavy, so he brought 10, like a sample. But obviously, that is not a valid answer, and we need to understand why, if his task was to bring us an indivisible Torah, a Torah that cannot be divided up or cut up in any way, why in fact were 10 singled out to be given, and why were they given in that different format than the rest of the Torah? A sub-question here would be, why 5 and 5? Right? Obviously, naturally, if you're going to bring down 2 and you have 2 hands and 5 fingers on each, you're going to have 5 commandments. But we really need to ask why it was in 2 sets of 5. And of course, if you have a deep appreciation, you'll ask why you have 5 fingers on each hand in the first place. Why are there 2 sides? Why, in fact, is the human body a bilateral structure? So we have 2s all the way through. And why, in fact, do we have 2 hands? But an extension of that deep question is why the Torah was given, the 10 commandments were given in 2. I noticed someone's asking a question. Let me ask you just to do me a favor, if you don't mind, to hold the questions, if you don't mind. Please remember them, note them down. We'll try to leave time at the end. There's always something I'll forget to explain or won't explain well enough. And so I'm very happy to answer the questions, but hold them if you don't mind, just because I've got a few screens full in front of me. I can't possibly see everyone or take everyone's questions. So please hold on to those. And if we don't get a chance to answer them in our session, please email me through the website. Very happy to answer anything that people send. But please, I'd like you to ask questions. So just note your questions and we'll stop for them. So the second part of the question is why 5 and 5 specifically? Now, if you research this question, I'm sure you allow me to drink while we talk. If you research this question and you ask what is unique about the 10 commandments, do a little research. Ask people, educated people, ask Jews, non-Jews. People will tell you that the 10 commandments, the reason they singled out, the reason those were given to us at Sinai and carved out specially, is because they're unique. What's unique about them? They are the major moral principles on which society is built. That's what people will tell you. And like most religious ideas about Judaism in the general world, that's wrong. So let's say it again. Ask any educated passerby on the street, what is the meaning of the 10 commandments? They will tell you the foundation of all Western religion, right? It is the big principles: killing, murder, adultery, theft, etc. These are the big principles, the principles of justice and morality, and they have been the underpinning values of society from the time they were given. That's what people tell you, and that is wrong. There is a dimension of truth to it, as I'll try to show, but it's not the essential idea. Before turning to what is the essential idea, let me try to demonstrate why that's wrong. First of all, when people tell you that these are the general moral principle on which a society is based, the obvious question that comes to mind is, why these 10? For example, the 10th one, not coveting. Not coveting, coveting is not a good idea. It's not nice. It's not a good quality of character. It's a small-minded and immature attitude, but it's not up there with murder and adultery and theft. After all, coveting is really an aspect of inner. Coveting in halachic terms is what you feel when you like something that belongs to someone else. True, practically you have to do some move to acquire it. But really the transgression is an emotion, is a desire. Is that improper desire really worthy of being listed with adultery and murder and theft? I don't think so. Other ones are the 10 commandments, for example, bearing false witness, against someone. There are many ways to harm people. You can be treacherous in many ways. Why does that one have to be in the 10 commandments? There are so many ways to be immoral and damaging and commit heinous crimes, right? To betray all sorts of moral values. Why are these the big ones on which society is based? Maybe murder and theft are primarily understandable, but the others I'm not sure. But there's another reason why it's not correct to say that the Ten Commandments are the basic values of society. And I'll tell you why. Because in Jewish teaching, there is a set of basic moral values, but they're not the Ten Commandments. They are the 7 Noahide laws. The Torah, in its very first couple of parshas, the Torah delineates 7 laws of mankind, not Jewish at all, basic laws of a society. And in fact, the Talmud in the tractate of Sanhedrin goes through the derivation of these 7. And they're not the same as the 10. There's some overlap. Stealing, adultery. By the way, adultery is debatable. In our learned sources, the question of adultery is really whether that fits under immorality. Is that an intimate male-female area which is being transgressed, or is it indeed falling under theft? After all, adulterous relationship means an interfering in someone else's personal, intimate relationship. There's an aspect of theft there. There's an interfering and taking for oneself something that should be precious and isolated and unique to the couple. So that's an interesting debate in the non-Jewish world. How does Judaism see the super category under which adultery falls? But be that as it may, it is there are a couple, and therefore in the non-Jewish, the so-called Noahide mitzvahs, the commandments give to Noah, sexual immorality is certainly listed. Theft is also listed, but some are not. For example, one of those 7 is eating the limb of an animal while the animal's alive. Right? Tremendous cruelty to animals. That's called Hyperemesis. Eating the limb or the blood of an animal while it's alive. That's not found in the Ten Commandments. To be sure, it's forbidden. Make no mistake about that. It's forbidden for Jews, but it's not one of the Ten Commandments. And therefore, the 7th of the 7 commandments, for example, is to establish a system of law and order. Now, that's called dinim. In fact, it's the only one that verges on being a positive command. All the others are negative. Stealing, adultery, cursing God, right, which doesn't appear formally in the Ten Commandments either. Taking the piece of a living animal. 7 of these commandments. The 7th being dinim. All the others are negative. You must not do these. The 7th is you must establish a system of courts and justice and law enforcement. And there's a debate about whether that indeed is a positive commandment or not. After all, it's an action you need to do. But on the other hand, it's really a protection for these rights and obligations in society. But be that as it may, there are 7 commandments. It's true that the 7 break down into 30 or 40 subcomponents. And for those of you who are interested, you can look them up. And there's learned work that is being produced on the mitzvahs for the non-Jews. And so there are 30 or 40 subcategories. Some people have asked, how can we say they're all negative commands? We're having children, right? Fruitful or multiply was given to Adam long before there were Jews on earth. That sounds like a positive command. There's a lot of learned discussion about the nature, the number and the nature of these commandments. But basically, there are 7 international commandments given to the human race, and they are not the 10 commandments. So, number 1, if people claim that the 10 commandments are the basic moral principles, I don't think so. Not coveting doesn't seem to be a basic moral principle. Number 2, the Torah does have a list of basic moral principles, and they're not the 10 commandments. So, my friends, if we are together here, we should understand that we have a problem. The problem is what is unique and special about the 10 commandments. They're not the basic moral principle of society, and they are not necessarily the most obvious basic moral principles. The answer to this is as follows. This will take a little while to explain, but it's very, very richly productive idea to understand deeply. The 10 commandments are not the most important moral principles. They're the general categories that contain all principles of the Torah. In other words, the 613, or to be full, the 620 mitzvahs, because we include 7 rabbinic mitzvahs, or indeed the 7 non-Jewish mitzvahs. So we have in total 620 mitzvahs, or the best known of them are the 613 mitzvahs. They are subsumed in 10 categories. Let's give a little attention to understanding what this means. Why, after all, you may ask, is it necessary to subsume and group all 613 commandments in categories? Why is that necessary? The answer is that the unfolding of reality in all dimensions always follows the same pattern. And that pattern in Torah is always this one. There's a unique seed, which is dimensionless and compressed, that contains all. That seed then germinates and reveals what was in the seed in a very beginning and fundamental way. Still much is hidden. That step then moves into the step that comes after, revealing more of what was there in the beginning. Each step is a true and loyal revelation of what was there in the previous step, nothing missing and nothing added, just more explicit. Until finally, at the end of the process, you end up with what is called the last step. The technical term of that in our deeper wisdom is called Malchus. Malchus means the step that adds nothing at all except full revelation. I would give you, if you like, a very modern analogy. Imagine a computer system. You have the software, the ideas in the software, the construction of the software, the writing of the code, and all the steps. Eventually it gets into the hardware of the computer and the processor, and eventually it ends up in your screen. The screen is the last step that interfaces with you. And that screen does nothing other than reveal the whole process that came before. The screen adds nothing of its own. All the screen does is reveal what was there before. In fact, if the screen shows you anything else, it's a bad screen. To put it in its most extreme form, there's one thing that a computer screen should never show you. There's one thing you should never see on the screen, and that's the screen. If you see the screen, it's obstructing. The screen should show you only the picture that it's showing you. And indeed, Kabbalistically, the midah of Malchus is called that which has nothing of its own. It reveals only the content without any obstruction or making anything of itself. A teacher, for example, a teacher should be invisible. A good teacher should demonstrate the subject so beautifully and so brilliantly that you don't see the teacher, you see the subject. A good actor, you shouldn't see a person playing a part. If you see the actor playing the part, he's a failure as an actor. If the actor plays the part correctly, all you see is the part being played. He should be completely transparent. Think about it for a moment. Who was the greatest teacher who ever lived? Moshe Rabbeinu. And he was totally transparent. He was the humblest of all people. No accident. Because when the ego is divested completely, then the reality shines through. And therefore, the final step adds nothing of its own. It only demonstrates. That's the pathway. I just stopped for a moment to share with you. I was privy in the last week to some wonderful acting. I spent the week in Spain with 950 Jews from around the world, students, young people becoming introduced to their Judaism. And as we walked through the streets of Madrid and Toledo and Segovia, they had actors. In fact, a friend of mine wrote the scripts. They had actors in the street acting out Spanish Inquisition scenes. Okay, Jews being insulted by the Christians, condemned to death and to be burned, acting out in the streets. You should have seen the Spanish locals. Right, you're talking about 300-400 people at a time, and enacted in the street, right? A scene from 500 years before with the robes and all the very, very dramatic. I mean, some of the Christians was actually a little bit too much to handle. But be that as it may, right? The actor, when we watched those scenes in the street, we didn't see modern American actors. We were transported back into the scene of Toledo 500 years ago, where Jews had to make choices about dying or remaining Jewish. But be that as it may, that's the last of the process. So here's the organic process that Judaism always expresses. A seed which nothing is visible, but all is contained. Then something becomes visible. And finally, the last step is visibility with no more seed element left to reveal. Let's take the most obvious example, the conception of a child. When a child is conceived, the male and female genes fuse. And in that moment, hidden in the inner recesses of the body, is a moment that contains everything, nothing visible. If you would put the microscope on it, all you'd see is one tiny cell, incredibly compressed. But in that cell is the future of the child, the color of his eyes and the shape of his nose and details of his personality. It's all there. Then the pregnancy begins. The cell begins to express itself, but it's still hidden. Then birth takes place. This more is revealed, but still a tremendous amount in potential. And gradually, as the human flourishes, you see more and more and more coming to revelation. At the end of a life, all you have is a full revelation of what that whole process was. And therefore, that is the organic process. In Torah, a list of things is never a shopping list in which the order is not important. It's never like that. The first step in Torah always contains all. If you remember only one thing from this talk, you need to remember that this is the theme of Torah. The first moment contains all. All contained, nothing revealed. The second step is a loyal expression of what was there in the first step. Nothing added, nothing distorted, and nothing removed. And then third step expresses the second step in more explicit revelation. And so the process goes on, each step loyal to the one that came before. This has tremendous consequences, by the way. It's not just abstract philosophical or Kabbalistic thought. It has tremendous consequences. For example, when you strive to understand a subject, always go back as far as you can to the moment of compressed essence. Always. If you haven't done that, you haven't understood the subject. In science, for example, we don't want the phenomena or the details. We want the rules, the laws, the underlying principle. In medicine, you don't want the details of the body. You want the diagnosis. You want the underlying principle. Once you grasp that, you've grasped everything. If you know the details, you don't have wisdom. If you know the principle, you have wisdom. Principle means, in physics today, they're looking for what they call GUTs, the guts, grand unifying theory. They want the grand. Who says there is a grand unifying theory? Everything says there must be a grand unifying theory. The rule or the law of physics or mathematics or chemistry, that's wisdom. If you, by the way, you want to be even more practical, if you have a human problem, a relationship problem, a family problem, someone difficult to work with, don't sweat the details. Go back to the underlying principle. What's the driver in that personality? What's the issue in the relationship? If you can put your finger on the issue, you can solve it. But if you're putting patches on details that are external, you'll never get anywhere. And therefore, whether it's human counseling, whether it's analysis of your own life, or an aspect of your own relationships, or a technical problem, or a professional problem, or an aesthetic problem, what's the underlying? Every work of art has a unique theme. If it doesn't have a unique theme, it's not a work of art, it's a mess. Every work of music, sculpture, painting, poetry, drama, literature, always there's a theme that runs through it. If there's not a unifying theme, it's not art. In Talmud, in Talmudic study, we're always looking for the underlying theme that ties it all together. And very often the Talmud doesn't tell you what it is. It leaves you to discover. You will grapple with a page of Talmud over and over. When you suddenly realize what the unifying principle is, it all makes sense. And therefore, there's a tremendous practical value to understanding this. Drive back for the point of origin. When you study Torah philosophical subjects, we are always looking to understand the underlying principle. Always. How do we do that? We have many techniques. One, probably the most important, what's the conceptual root of this whole subject? Number two, where does the Torah mention it for the first time? Because as the Torah unfolds from the word Bereshis, Genesis, in which all is contained, it unfolds and reveals more and more and more until the end of the Torah, nothing more to be revealed. And therefore, to understand a Torah subject deeply, go back to the first time it's mentioned. Any subject in Torah, if you didn't drive back to the first time it appears in Torah, the Talmud says if you dream the letter Tet, Tes, the ninth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, if you dream the letter Tes, Yitzapa L'Tov, expect something good will happen. Why? Because the word Tov begins with a Tet. Ask the Gaon of Vilna the obvious question. There are a lot of bad words in Hebrew that begin with a Tet as well. So why should you assume something good's going to happen? Says the Gaon, an eye-opening comment. Because the first time a Tes appears in Torah is in the word Ki Toiv. And if that's the first time the letter appears as the root of the word of goodness, that will always be its ultimate root. Also means that the bad words in Torah that start with a Tes also have a root in goodness. It must be like that. And therefore go back to the first time it appears. Go back to the word itself. In Torah, the words are the genetic materials. The letters of the words are the genes that build the concept. That's why in Torah, the word for a word, davar, is the same as the word for an object, davar. Other languages are not like that. Because in other languages, a thing is a thing and a word is a word. In Torah, the thing is the word that the Torah speaks it into existence using that methodology. And therefore, look at the Hebrew word. You're going back to the genes. No one serious about medicine would fail to go back to the embryology to understand something. And no one serious about embryology would fail to go back to the genetics. If you didn't follow a medical problem back to the genes, you've been incompetent. You always go back to the deepest root. Once you've grasped the root, you grasp it all. Torah is nothing other than this pattern. I'll just give you two examples. Here's one. The Torah has two beginnings. It begins chronologically with the word Bereshis and rolls on from there. And it begins temporally from the word Anochi, I am God, namely the first of the 10 commandments, and rolls down from there. Two types of beginning. Let's take the word Bereshis. The word Bereshit in the beginning is the first word of the Torah, and therefore it contains the whole Torah. The word Bereshis, the first word of the Torah, contains the whole Torah. It must do if it's the first word. I'll give you an example. The Gaon of Vilna was famous for saying that the word Bereshis contains all 613 mitzvahs, as it must. It's the moment of conception. once he was sitting at a pidyon haben, right? The 30-day ceremony of redeeming the firstborn child. And as they were sitting at the meal, one of the students turned and they said, Rabbi, you told us that every mitzvah in the Torah is contained in the word breshis. Where does the word breshis say pidyon haben? And the Gaon said, look at the word. Look at the 6 letters. Ben, Rishon, Achash, Shloshim, Yom, Tifteh. You shall redeem the firstborn son after 30 days. That's what the 6 letters spell. And he could have done that with any of the mitzvahs in the Torah. If it's the first word, it contains them all. Is this a game? No, that's how Torah works. I'll give you a Kabbalistic example for those interested in Kabbalistic wisdom. The 6 letters of the word Bereshis, by the way, why are there 6 letters? Because God created 6 days. The Shabbos is not a day. The Shabbos is the composite tachlis of all the days. Of course, the first word in the Torah has 6 letters because those were the elements of creation. By the way, again, according to Kabbalah, rearrange the letters, the 6 letters of the word Bereshis, and you get how many permutations? I'm sure we have some genius mathematicians among you. And you will know that there are 720 permutations of 6 letters. 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2. If you take each of those 720 permutations of the letters, each one spells Bereshis in another way. For example, Bereshis in the beginning. Bara Shes, he created 6. That's what it actually says. Break up the word. Bara Shes, he created 6. Yirei Shabbos, awe of the Shabbat, which is the endpoint of creation. Bris Eish, a covenant of fire. Yashar Aleph Beis Taf, to go straight from the Aleph Bet to the Taf. How about this one? Aleph Betishrei, the date, right? The date of Rosh Hashanah. That's what the word spells. Aleph Betishrei, the first of Tishrei. And each way you rearrange the letters, and there are many, many more, each way you rearrange the letters is another expression of a point of origin. It's the first word. It contains the Torah. Right? And therefore, that is how the Torah unfolds. The book of Genesis, of course, contains the whole Torah in root. The next book is an expression of those principles as they are manifest in one unique people, the Jewish people who are being formed then. The first book is universal, right? With only the roots. The second book, the book of Shmos, is where the Jewish people begin to be formed, etc., etc. That is always the pattern. But the Torah has another point of origin. And here we come to the 10 Commandments. Just like the Torah begins with a bet and Bereshis and rolls on chronologically, it also begins with the 10 Commandments and rolls down vertically. And therefore, here's the secret. The 10 Commandments are the point of origin of the Torah. Those 10 categories contain the rest. And obviously, all of the 10 are contained in the first one, I am. The first of the 10 Commandments, beginning not with a bet, like Bereshis, but beginning with an Aleph, a deeper source of origin, a deeper point of origin, right? And the Aleph, of course, is the ultimate point of origin. What is an Aleph? 2 Yuds and a Vav. Look how an Aleph is written. 2 Yuds and a Vav. Yud, the 10 Kabbalistic emanations coming down from the spiritual world, reflected in obverse as they are in this world, connected by the letter Vav, which means connection. Vav in Hebrew means a hook. The grammatical construct of a Vav means and, what we call conjunction. And what are the 2 Yuds and a Vav? 26, Hashem's name. 2 10s and a 6, 26, Hashem's name. For those who are interested in the counting of the Omer, which we are going through now, we have 32 days that are root days. And then Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day. The Aleph is also 32. It's 2 10s and 2 6s because Vav in Hebrew is Vav, 2. So you have 12 and 20, 32. And therefore 32, which is Lev, the heart, is 32. So the first 32 days of the Omer are the expression of an Aleph, which is a root. And then the flame can be lit of Lag BaOmer. And from then on, it all becomes a process of external revelation. And therefore, here's the principle. The whole Torah is contained in the 10, not because they're more important, not because they're the basic moral principles. They're the root categories that contain the rest of the Torah. When Moshe Rabbeinu came down the mountain with the 10 Commandments, he was bringing the whole Torah. He wasn't bringing a sample. He was bringing the 10 major categories, each of which unfolds into dozens of mitzvahs, to give an organized set of 10 in 10 separate categories, each one with its own character and its own flavor. If you look in the writings of Rav Saadia Gaon, he has a siddur. He begins the siddur with a beautiful poetic rendition of each of the 613 mitzvahs, showing you in which of the 10 commandments each one is rooted. Some are easy, right? All the festivals, for example, and Rosh Chodesh, and all the time-bound issues, they're all expressed in the root of Shabbos. But But it takes a little skill to know where's sending away the mother bird contained, where's so each of the mitzvahs needs wisdom to know in which of the 10 commandments it's rooted. But indeed, he does that. He doesn't explain how he knows which commandment is rooted in which of the 10. But he does that. The Ramban does the same thing. Many of our commentaries explain the same idea. And therefore, the 10 commandments are not more important. Well, they're more important in this way, that they're the root categories. This also means anytime you fulfill a mitzvah, you're also fulfilling the root mitzvah, which is the source of that detailed mitzvah in the 10 commandments. And obviously, anytime you fulfill any positive mitzvah, you're also fulfilling, I am God who gave the mitzvahs. And anytime you break any negative commandment, you're also breaking, have no gods before me, because you're worshiping something else. And they're all rooted in the second of the commandments. And so the first 2 commandments, I am God, and don't betray me, right? Don't worship anything else. Those are the 2 roots of the positives and the negatives, or the right and left hands. And that is the nature of the 10 commandments. Nothing to do with being major moral principles. Not coveting is not a major, but it's a root of all that wrong emotional, psychological orientation results in the world. And that is the nature of the 10 commandments. And Torah always works in that way, a unitary source into major categories, subcategories, and details. I'll tell you an example of this. I can see we're not going to have much time for honoring parents today, but I think it's important to lay down the principle. Perhaps next time we meet, we can take some specifics. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, when I was a student in Yeshiva in Israel, I had a friend who is a very interesting fellow. His name's Ronnie Ilan. He was a pilot in the Israeli Air Force, a fighter pilot. He got turned on to religion, became very learned in subsequent years. Today he's a major personality in Torah study. He was a student of Rav Moshe Shapiro, my great Rebbe. Rav Moshe Shapiro, one of the great minds of the last generation, right, who taught me most of what I know. Remarkable, indescribable personality. And Ronnie Ilan became very, very enamored and very close to Rav Moshe Shapiro. And he told me that every Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos, they would sit around Rav Moshe's table, they'd have a shiur. What was the subject of the shiur? There were 7 or 8 senior students, and the shiur was whatever they wanted to talk about. So Rav Moshe would say to them, what would you like to talk about this week? The first fellow would say the parsha of the week. The second fellow would say the Sukkah Shel Levi Yoson, very deep Kabbalistic idea. And he would get 7 or 8 completely different subjects that they wanted to talk about. And after a moment's thought, he would talk about one subject that was the essence of all of them. I'm not talking about connecting things. I can also connect things. You give me 7 or 8 Torah subjects, I'll find some way to connect them. I'm not talking about connecting. I'm talking about one thing, very often, by the way, which was none of the 8. But after he explained it, suddenly you could see it was the essence of all of those 7 questions. By the way, in subsequent years, I saw it myself. Over the years, he used to visit London, and we used to have shiurim. And one of the shiurim was we'd sit around the table, and 10 or 12 or 15 or 25 people, and he would say, what would you like to talk about? Any good questions? Of course, the bad questions he demolished. Right? Once a student asked a question, Rav Moshe said to him, that question's not even stupid. The fellow was Israeli, so it didn't bother him, But I mean, the point is, and no patience for, but the good questions, he would give a shiur about one subject that was the essence. If you'd like to experience this yourself, by the way, if your Hebrew is not good enough, go to my website, go to the advanced tab. By the way, we're rebuilding the website. I'd just like to announce that because it's not user-friendly at the moment. And so we are now redesigning it in a very streamlined and beautiful way. And in Yitz Hashem, in the next few weeks, that'll be out and ready. Featuring books in all the languages and all the shiurim and the videos, much more accessible. Go to the advanced tab, and there you will find, if you click on that, you'll see Rav Moshe Shapiro. If your Hebrew and Yiddish is good enough, you can listen to his shiurim. But there are 15 or 20 shiurim that I collected from Rav Mordechai Miller. Rav Miller was the star pupil of Rav Dessler. I had privileged to know him. And I spent a couple of years collecting recordings of his classic shiurim from around the world. They were on cassettes and not digital. And so I cleaned them up and digitized them. And I've made 15 or 20 or 25 of his absolutely classic. He gave a series of basic hashkafa or Torah philosophical shiurim. And that is, I don't see how you can be authentically Jewish without going through that, as heard from Rav Dessler himself. And here's how he gives a shiur. And listen to it yourself, you'll find it fascinating. He starts the shiur by asking 5 unrelated questions. Weird and unrelated. And then he talks about a sixth thing that's got nothing to do with any of the five. And as he talks, you suddenly start seeing how all the five things are connected. And by the time he's finished, there's nothing in the world other than the principle that is used to tie them together. First of all, it's fascinating. And secondly, it holds an audience's interest. And thirdly, it's a better proof to the existence of God than trying to prove that God exists, because you're taking disparate, disconnected things in the world and showing that there's unitary theme. Shem Elokeinu, Shem Echad. That's the deepest obsession of the Jewish soul, and you see it done before your eyes. So that's, I recommend, a technique you can use and in all your assembling of wisdom. Anyway, when Rav Moshe used to do that, and he would talk about one thing that was miraculously an answer to all 6 or 7 questions, I was much too afraid to ask him how that could be done. I mean, look at this face. Would you walk up to him and say, how you doing? You know, you'd probably melt. I was much too afraid to speak to him, but I was very close to Rav Simcha Wasserman, who was my teacher, and he was very approachable, and our families related, and I felt I could ask him. So I went up to Rav Wasserman. He must have been 80 years old at the time. And I said, you know, Rav Wasserman, Rabbi Shapiro gives a shiur. They ask him 6 questions. He talks about one thing, and it's all of those. How does he do that? Rav Simcha looked at me with those clear blue eyes. And he said, but you have to understand that Torah is an Eitz Chaim. It's a tree of life. What is a tree? A tree has one trunk, some big branches, some smaller branches, some smaller and smaller branches, and eventually a lot of twigs. Whenever anyone asks you to connect any Torah subjects together, note which twigs they're talking about, simply follow them back till you get to a common branch and speak about that. Isn't it easy? Now you might have to know the tree. Okay, you have to know your stuff. But if you know the tree, that's what you can do. And if you know a professional subject, that's what you will do. Someone asks you about your professional subject, whether it's medicine or accounting or law, whatever it is, you know to speak about the principle. That's what you do. Once you've grasped and shown them the operating principle, all the rest will flow. It will hold attention. It will be beautiful, it'll be easy to understand, and it will be true. And therefore, that is the way the Torah works. It is always going back to a point of origin. And obviously, any mitzvah in the Torah needs to be seen in terms of the context of which of the 10 commandments it follows from. That is the theme. Are we together on this? Is this message clear? Anyone out there? Okay. Let's spend a few minutes without the risk of boring people, but let's spend just a few minutes talking about at least one application of this. We won't have time to go into it fully, but at least to show an application. The 10 commandments are disposed in 2 sets. There are 2 sets of 5 and 5. What's the reason for this? Again, without delving too much into the background, the world is always split into 2 sets of concepts, positive commandments and negative commandments, right? That says it all. There are 2 groups only. They're the positive and the negative. In Kabbalistic terms, these are called the male and the female. That's the right side and the left side. One of the applications of duality is always giver and receiver. Giver and receiver. Male, female is a classic giving, receiving duality, right? There's always the giver and the taker, the giver and the receiver, the male and the female, the left and the right. It's always a world of dual reality. And therefore, there are 2 sets of commandments. And they break down into the first set being those of the giver, and secondly, those of the receiver. Or put it this way, the first 5 commandments are the commandments that oblige a relationship between humans and God. The second 5 are those that oblige a relationship between humans and humans. In other words, the first 5 commandments, I am God. Don't have any other gods before me. Don't use my name in vain. Keep the Shabbos. These are mitzvahs that are a relationship between us and God. The other mitzvahs, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't bear false witness. These are all commandments between, don't covet other people's things. These are 5 commandments that govern our human interrelationships. And therefore, there are clearly 2 completely conceptually different sets. The first are God and me. The second are me and you. Those are the 2 formats. But here comes a very, very interesting question. Look at them carefully and you will see that the 2 sets are parallel exactly parallel. Rashi beautifully points this out. Rashi says, Shtei Shadaich, he's talking about the beauty of a woman. He's talking about her figure. Again, this is Shir HaShirim, right? The Song of Songs. He talks about it's a sensual love song between husband and wife. And he's talking about the 2 sides of her beauty and her body. And there he says, like 2 twins. These are the 2 twins. And Rashi says the 2 twins are the 2 sets of law, right? The 2 the five commandments that govern our relationship, nurturing, so to speak, like the breast that is describing, and the other are the commandments between humans, between us. And the two sets are parallel, right? And how they, and many of our commentaries speak this out in detail. Let's observe the parallels. Fascinating. Let's take 5 and 5. The first of the man God or human God commandments is I am God, defining the absolute source of spirituality in the world, that God emanates his being into the world. What is the first of the human commandments? Don't kill. In other words, don't expunge from the world the divine essence. Where's the divine presence represented in the world? In a human soul. The human soul is the presence of God, a projection of the divine into the world. And therefore, to bring God into the world is the first of the commandments. And the first of the negative man-man commandments is don't expunge the divine being from the world, which is what you do when you kill someone. You can't kill a soul. All you can do is banish it from the world. That's what killing is. Take the second one. You shall have no gods before me. Don't betray this most important of relationships. What's the second of the human commandments? Don't commit adultery. The deepest treachery in all human relationships. The most deep and loyal and meaningful of all relationships is the marriage one. And a treachery in that is the deepest treachery. So, and that's incidentally why always the Torah describes idolatry in terms of God's jealousy, right? In terms of the Torah never speaks of his jealousy except in terms of idolatry. When you're worshiping something other, you're breaking that marital bond. Very clear. What's the third one? You shall do not use my name in vain. Don't use my name. Don't use my stuff for you. Don't use my name for your purposes. What's the third of the human mitzvahs? Do not steal. Don't use anybody else's stuff for you. Very clearly parallel. What's the fourth commandment? Keep the Shabbos. What is Shabbat? Shabbos is a testimony to God's creation. After all, what do we do on Shabbos? Nothing. We don't create. We give testimony that God created the world. What's the fourth of the man-man commandments? Don't bear false testimony against a human being. Exactly parallel. And the fifth one needs a little explanation, and that is number one, honor your parents. That's the fifth of the man-God commandments. And on the human side, do not covet. And here we come to two fascinating questions. The more obvious question is, why is honoring parents on the human-God interface? After all, parents are human. Now, many teenagers would be hard put to admit that, I know. But, in essence, parents are human. They're a special case of a human relationship, but there's no doubt that they're human. Why would the Torah include honoring parents as the fifth of the human-God interactions? Again, surely it's a unique case of human-human interaction. Surely it's better placed on the second set of commandments. And second question is, how is it parallel to coveting? Let's at least begin to explain that, although today we won't have time to go into the halachic details of honoring parents, which is what I'd hope to do. But in future, we can discuss that. And on the website, you will find a discussion of the 10 Commandments in terms of honoring parents. And there you will find a lot of the specifics. This applies no matter what age you are. It applies even after death, even after parents have died, right? It's still an obligation to honor them. You're not allowed to use a parent's first name, whether they're alive or not. There's a lot to talk about. And I thought that the theme of honoring Suzanne, Adele, Beverly, the Katz family, honoring their mum, who's your tzadis today, I thought that would be appropriate. But although we won't go into the details of honoring parents, let's just try to understand at least why it's the fifth of the man-God, human-God commandments, and why it's parallel to not coveting. And the answer is along these lines, is that, you remember we said that all organic processes unfold from a root and finally get down to full external expression in the world. Let's look at the first 5 commandments. I am Hashem, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. That's absolute root. What's the end of the sequence of that 5? Parents. What are parents? Parents are the final end of the chain of Hashem's creation before you come into being. Hashem begins the process, and it goes through Adam and Eve, and through the generations, and finally comes down to your grandparents, and then your parents, and then you. When you look back to your parents, you're looking back to God through a chain of causation. Let's understand this. It's an amazing thing to understand. Why is honoring parents worthy of being on the 10 Commandments? It's wonderful to honor your parents. It's very important. It's one of the most, but why one of the 10 Commandments? The answer is it's absolutely fundamental. Relating to parents is relating to a source. right? When you look at your parents, when you turn back to your parents, from then, if you have any sense, you'll go back to your when you look back to your parents, you're looking at your point of origin. The reason, if you like, the conceptual reason why you're required to honor parents is because you owe everything to them. And that's why the Rambam and other authorities rule that even if your parents are bad people, you have to respect them. If your parents are bad people and they abandon you and they brutalized you and they abused you and they are no good, they spend their days hanging out with a Sicilian crowd, with their, carrying machine guns. You stand up when they walk into the room. You're not allowed to respect their values. That's out of the question. But you owe your life to them. Whether they wanted you or not is irrelevant. You look back to parents as your immediate proximate cause. And if you have any sense, from there you'll get to your grandparents. And if you're a thinker, you'll get from there all the way back to Adam and Eve. And when you get back there, you'll get back to God. And therefore, looking at your parents is not only decent and refined, and the Torah regards non-Jews as obliged in the same thing from the perspective of decency. It is a deep appreciation of source. And what did we say is the essence of wisdom? Go back to source. Trace things back to their point of origin. And therefore, honoring parents has many dimensions. You know that in Torah, all dimensions of Torah always parallel. Halachic dimension, Kabbalistic dimension, Musa dimension, which means refinement of character, philosophical dimension, they all parallel. Well, let's examine it. Halachically, honor your parents. Philosophically, go back to your point of origin, right? Musa, gratitude. What is gratitude? Going back to the source that you owe. In Hebrew, the word to thank is exactly the same as the word for admission. Modeh in Hebrew means to thank, and it means to admit. Why? When I thank you, I'm in fact admitting that it came from you and not from me. It's an admission. I couldn't have done this or been this without you. And therefore, when you go back to your parents, halachically, you're fulfilling the mitzvah of honoring parents. Kabbalistic, philosophically, you're going back to a point of origin, which is always what philosophical wisdom is. Character building, you're acknowledging source. You're admitting it's not me. My life is owed to someone else. And therefore, you are always, it's the same theme of tracing, and a person who honors parents correctly will become God conscious. Because if you understand that you don't owe your existence to yourself, you owe it to a prior source, you must trace everything back to an ultimate prior source. And therefore, there's nothing more important on the Ten Commandments than honoring parents, because it will take you back to God. It's the external expression of what God is. Your parents are the interface between God's creation and what you are. They are the proximate cause. Behind them stands God. After them stands you. And therefore, your parents relate to you as God does. And that's why that's why honoring parents is in the first 5 of the commandments. Because honoring your parents is indeed an interface with, and that's why it's the 5th of the first 5. Because the first 5 are your man-God interactions, and the 5th of them is the transitional zone, where the last ebb of your relationship with Hashem segues or moves into the beginning of your relationship with other people. And therefore, it's the 5th of the first 5 and the transitional one that takes you from your relationship with Hashem into the beginning of a relationship with other people. Because on the one hand, your parents are godly because they're your point of origin. On the other hand, they're human beings. So it's exactly philosophically perfectly placed as the interface between you and Hashem on the one side and you and humans on the other. Let's spend just a couple of minutes trying to answer, why is that parallel to not coveting? And then, unfortunately, we run out of time. It's amazing how fast time goes when you're having fun. But let's just briefly relate to, if it's the 5th of the commandments on the first side and the 10th on the second side, the 5th of the second set, how are they parallel? And a moment's thought will show you this. And there are other ways to say it, and other commentaries put it in other ways, but I'm giving you one of the ways to conceive of this. When you honor parents correctly, what you are practicing is correct attribution. Correct attribution means I'm attributing all that I am to my parents. Okay, so it's not me, it goes back there. The essence belongs there. Without that, and when you covet, you are doing exactly the parallel activity, right, in the human realm. Not coveting means attributing correctly whatever belongs to that individual and applying it there. If that was given to them, that person's house, his wife, his possessions, his money, whatever it is, if God gave it to him, that's where it belongs. So it's correct attribution. I attribute my existence to its correct, I place it in the correct position. It's with my parents and not with me. And in the human interaction, I attribute correctly all that you are and all that you have to you and not to me. in the child-parent relationship, I arrogate to myself nothing. I don't see myself as being the center of existence. I attribute that elsewhere. In the human-human interaction, I don't arrogate to myself the right to your possessions, your relationships, your good fortune, your money. I place that correctly, and I owe that to you. And therefore, in both of them, they are different modes of the same, or different examples of the same mode. In both of them, it is an utter humility. I am nothing without my parents who brought me into the world. And in terms of possessions, I have no right whatsoever, not even to a desire for anybody else's things, because I attribute them correctly to where they belong. There's more to say about it, but that's the general theme. And therefore, this is why the Torah is so extreme about honoring people, honoring parents. Namely, you stand up when they walk into the room, you may not use their first name. There's so many laws about honoring parents, both positively what you need to do for them, and negatively what you must not disrespect in any way. That is the mitzvah. And that's why the Torah is so extreme about not coveting. According to some opinions, the transgression of coveting is simply wanting, simply conceiving the desire. That's the famous opinion of the Ibn Ezra. He says that when you look across the fence and you see your neighbor's possession, or spouse, or money, whatever it is, if you conceive a desire, you've transgressed. You've said nothing. You never reveal it. No one ever knows. You've broken one of the 10 commandments. Fortunately for most of us, we don't rule that way. We rule that you only transgress when you make a move to get that stuff. You convince your neighbor that he should get divorced. She's not a good woman, so that you can marry her. Or you convince him to sell an object so that you can buy it. Or you make a move, you do an action. You're not guilty for the action, of course, because you're not stealing. After all, you convince him, he does it willingly. You're guilty for the thought and the emotion. But you're only guilty when you make a move. But in essence, you are guilty for the thought. Ibn Ezra himself asked the question, how could the Torah possibly prohibit a desire? It can prohibit actions, but how can it prohibit a desire? His answer is, if you understood the message correctly, of correct attribution, that what you weren't given has nothing to do with you, you wouldn't dream of thinking it could belong to you. You only conceive a desire for something that you think might be relevant to you. In his unforgettable phrase, he says, the peasant on the farm with the heavy muddy boots never conceives a desire to marry the princess. Why? Because it's out of the realm of possibility. Although I must admit, when I give this class in the Beis Yaakov, you know, the high school, the girls' high school, they always say, Rabbi, the peasant always marries the princess. Well, maybe, but that's the example he gives. And therefore, you will only conceive a desire for something that you think is possibly relevant to you. Anyway, this is the theme. We've just begun talking about the pattern of the 10 Commandments. That is the thing to think about as you go through the receiving of the Torah this coming Friday, Shabbos, right? Celebrating, going back to a point of origin. When you stand in the morning, on Friday morning, and we reenact that receiving of the Torah, so to speak, standing again at Sinai, which we do all the time. The Ramban says our minds and our eyes and our hearts should be there always. Every time the Torah is read in public, it's a reenactment. By the way, when the Torah is read in public, that's why we always have 3 people standing around the Torah, just like the original of the giving of the Torah, Hashem, Moshe, and us, the giver, the intermediary, and the receiver. And therefore, we reenact that every time the Torah is read. And so when we stand this coming Shavuos on Shavuot and we reenact the receiving of the Torah, what we're doing is going back to the point in time, which was the point of origin. And we re-experience that explosion of divine human interaction, which was that event that ignited all of history, all of Jewish history, and beyond that, all of world history, really. All of the West takes its point of origin in terms of its value system back to there. And therefore, the next time somebody tells you the 10 Commandments are the big moral principles, you should say to them, well, maybe yes or maybe not, but they're the big categories. They are the categories that contain all the details. Wisdom is going back and defining the root categories. And this has been a brief introduction to the theme of the pattern of the 10 Commandments, using an example of parents and coveting. We have some other time to go into the details, but I wish you all a wonderful Shavuos, a wonderful year of Torah, receiving Torah. Thanks to Ariel, thanks to all of you, and look forward to seeing you again through the website. Please check out the website. Check out the book section where you'll hopefully see Ruthie's book for pregnant women and my books. And take us a couple of weeks to get it up and running, but please see that. Help us promote the books, please. You know, anyone with a difficult pregnancy, please recommend the books, and look forward to seeing you again on via the newsletter and live. All the best.